Do the Falcons have enough dudes to be an explosive offense in 2023?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, and of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen each and every day. Of course, make sure you follow and subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode of Locked On Falcons is going to be all about finding those dudes that can make this Falcons offense explosive, and it's piggybacking off of what we discussed on yesterday's episode, where we talked about the Falcons' tendency to have those long drives under Desmond Ridder over those final 4 games of the season, and their ability to convert in the red zone being very important, if not critical, if they sustain that same style of offense in 2023. Now, when we talk about the explosiveness, it's not as if the red zone no longer becomes a factor for your team success if you have an explosive offense, but that explosiveness can often, at least sometimes, bypass the red zone, because if you're scoring from 30 yards out, you don't even have to get into the red zone. And we've talked quite a bit on this podcast over the years and in recent days and weeks about why explosiveness matters. And the main reason is it's very hard to be consistently methodical in today's NFL, to be able to get 5 yards here, 10 yards here consistently. And, especially when it comes to converting third downs, right? And the simplest way of breaking it down is by generating those explosive plays, you're bypassing third downs that you need to convert that are harder for you to convert in this league. And that's the value of explosiveness. And, I feel like I've been ahead of the curve on the explosiveness and why its importance in this league, because I was writing about its importance for this Atlanta Falcons team way back in 2013, back on falcfans.com, RIP. And, now everybody talks about offenses being explosive. It's part of the reason why the Shanahan, McVay, Andy Reid coaching trees have sort of taken the league by storm, because those are some of the top play callers and are very good at being explosive. It's why so many head coaches nowadays are offensive-minded guys, because teams are looking to be explosive on offense. And that's why the defensive changes have gone from sort of the Seahawks-style defense, cover 3 base type of defense, to a lot of more too high looks, which are specifically designed to try and limit those explosive plays. So if you want to call me an innovator and an icon, because I was talking about this, 10 years ago, and everybody else only started talking about this 6-7 years ago, go ahead. But of course, I'm so humble, and I won't necessarily force that label of it as an innovator and icon onto you. But if you want to use those words, then by all means do so. But when we talk about the explosiveness of this Falcons offense, we talk about, the play calling. And this has been a through line. My biggest knock on Arthur Smith since we hired him, going back and watching his Titans offense and these last 2 seasons in Atlanta, that my biggest knock on him is I don't know if his offense does a great job fitting those trends of designing and scheming up explosive plays, right? That his offenses in Tennessee in the last couple of years in Atlanta have been mostly reliant on having quote unquote dudes, right? That really it boils down to yak, right? Whether we're talking about yards after contact for a running back or yards after the catch for a receiver. We saw Derrick Henry was the top yak yards after contact running back in the league in both years under Arthur Smith. We saw A.J. Brown being one of the top yards after catch receivers, because he would often take those 12-yard digs that Ryan Tannehill was tossing and turn them into big plays. When we look at yak for Corey Davis, our favorite prospective Falcons number 2 wide receiver, Corey Davis was at least average, if not above average, in terms of generating those yards after catch for a starting wide receiver. Jonnu Smith was, one of their top playmakers in Tennessee and was top 10 among tight ends pretty consistently in both years in terms of generating those yards after catch per reception. And, to be fair to Arthur Smith, he's still relatively young in his play calling experience. This is only his 5th year as a play caller in the NFL. And I don't think it's fair to suggest that he is a fully formed entity at this point in time, because you look at some of the other top play callers in the league. Kyle Shanahan, his 5th year as a play caller was that magical 2012 year with RG3 in Washington. Sean McVay's 5th year as a play caller in the NFL was that first Super Bowl run that the Rams made in 2018. Andy Reid's 6th year was the first time Philadelphia was able to make it to the Super Bowl. And I think, we often understand that players take a while to develop in the NFL, but I think fans often make the mistake of thinking coaches are fully formed upon, getting their first opportunity on the sideline or up in the booth. And, I don't think players and coaches are any different. The development does happen. And, it's been a big reason why I've been a lot more praising of Arthur Smith on this podcast in the calendar year of 2023 than I was heading into the 2022 season, because I saw a lot of growth from Arthur Smith as a coach, as a play caller over, in the 2022 season from what we saw in 2021. And I hope we can continue to see that develop in 2023 and into the future. But in terms of the raw numbers, in terms of the Falcons' explosiveness last year, they were 22nd in the NFL with 54 explosive plays, those 20-plus yard plays. Now, when you adjust per play, they look a little bit better. If you look at per drop back, their pass explosiveness was 17th in the NFL. If you look at per rushing attempt, their rushing explosiveness was 11th in the NFL. And you can imagine the Falcons, with the additions that they've made this offseason, especially a Bijan Robinson, if, say, Bijan was to add 5 more explosive runs, and you assume that the Falcons run the ball and throw the ball just exactly as much as they did last year, which is probably not a safe assumption, but just go with me here for a second. If Bijan was to add 5 more explosive plays to the 17 explosive runs that the Falcons had last year, they would go from 11th to 4th in a per rushing attempt explosiveness metric. If Drake London and Kyle Pitts were to add 12 more explosive catches to the 15 that those two combined to have last year, the Falcons would go from the 17th most explosive passing attack per drop back to the number 1 passing attack in the league in terms of explosiveness per drop back. So clearly there's not a massive leap that the Falcons have to make. Basically, as I outlined, with 5 more runs from Bijan, 12 more catches from London and Pitts, that's 17 more plays. That's on average 1 per game. And all of a sudden the Falcons are one of the most explosive offenses in the league, one of the top 5 most explosive offenses in the league, on par with teams like the Bills and others that are, considered very explosive. And we saw Kyle Pitts, have a lot of explosive plays in 2021 that he did not necessarily have in 2022. He had 5 explosive plays last year in roughly 10 games and 16 in roughly 16 games as a rookie. And we already discussed, 2 weeks ago, how if Desmond Ridder is league average in terms of hitting those deep passes to Kyle Pitts specifically, you're potentially looking at a half dozen or more explosive plays just to Kyle Pitts. That will certainly, that's already a third of the way there, just getting Kyle Pitts back to more of his rookie numbers, and you're a third of the way there to being one of the more explosive offenses. So we'll explore that a little bit more in detail moving forward. But overall, even though I've expressed previously, my skepticism over how explosive the Falcons will be, I do think this team being one of the more explosive offenses in the NFL is a realistic goal. Right. My skepticism mostly stems from I tend to be a person that needs to see it before I can believe it. But we'll break it down as we continue today's episode, and we'll talk about how many dudes the Falcons actually have on the roster. And we'll start things off by talking about probably the biggest dude that the Falcons added to their offensive lineup with Bijan Robinson. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But it is the perfect time to make a fast break to FanDuel for the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. And you can bet on the NBA finals. You can bet on the upcoming NBA draft or the upcoming NFL season. If you think Bijan Robinson is that dude, those odds for him being the offensive rookie of the year are favorable. You can bet on baseball, tennis, golf, whatever you want, all at America's #1 sportsbook by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you'll get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So let's talk about Bijan Robinson. And I myself have made this comparison. I've seen others make this comparison between Bijan Robinson and Derrick Henry. And it's not because their play styles are exactly the same or their body types are exactly the same. They're far different. But, when you watch Tennessee, a lot of times that offense, especially when it came to explosiveness, was just hand the ball off to Derrick Henry and let him work, right? That's what we mean when we call him being a dude, right? And there's not a whole lot of intention, right? There's no whole lot of design when it comes to drawing up and scheming up explosive run plays, because if it was that easy to do it, then everybody would be doing it. But this is one area where having a good running back still does matter, despite what you may have heard from other folks. And when you look at Derrick Henry's numbers in Tennessee under Arthur Smith, those 2 years in 2019 and 2020, Derrick Henry led the NFL with 25 20-plus yard runs across those 2 years. And we can imagine Bijan Robinson doing something similar. And based off of what he did in college, I think there's very much reason to believe that he can put up comparable numbers here in Atlanta in the future. That when we talk about the yards after contact, Bijan Robinson was 4th in the nation this past year in terms of yards after contact. We talk about the missed tackles force, where he had 104 missed tackles forced according to PFF, which is the most that they've ever tabulated for a running back in I think roughly the 10 years that they've been breaking down college film. So clearly that's a guy that can win after contact, and we saw Bijan generate his fair share of explosive plays at Texas. Now, PFF doesn't do 20-plus yard runs when it comes to running back. They distinguish 15-plus yard runs as those breakaway runs, and Bijan had 21 of those breakaway runs, which was among the top 15 running backs in the nation last year. And when you look at the percentage, though, of his overall runs from a percentage standpoint, how many of those breakaway runs were his overall runs? It was about 39%, which of those 15 guys that had 21 or more breakaway runs, that would have ranked 12th in terms of percentage among that group. So it wasn't a high percentage. Now, when you look at Bijan's freshman year, it was about 64% of his runs were those breakaway runs, and that was in part due to him being a part-time runner and not having to carry as much of a load. And I think that bodes well for what he could do this year in Atlanta, because I do think he'll probably be more of a part-time player, at least initially, here in Atlanta. And I think the potential is there for Bijan to be an explosive running back. I think you all recognize the skill set. I don't have to sit here and wax poetic about that. That's so obvious. But I also, for funsies, as they say, looked up how many 12 to 19-yard runs that each team in the NFL had this past year, with the idea of okay, maybe the Falcons, maybe Bijan's turning what used to be an 18-yard run into a 20-plus yard run, what used to be a 13-yard run into a 20-plus yard run. And the Falcons ranked 4th in the NFL this past year when it came to those 12 to 19-yard runs. They had 37 such of those runs. Algier had 13. CP Cordero Patterson had 10. And I think most would agree that Bijan probably brings a little bit more juice than either one of those guys at that position, so has the greater potential to turn those into more explosive runs. And so if Bijan is 15-20% better at turning those 12 to 19-yard runs into 20-plus yard runs, that's how you can get another 5 explosive runs this season from Bijan than you got a year ago. And that's not even that may be selling him short, because I'm sure some of you are like, well, he's more than 15 to 20% better than those guys. He's 50% better than those guys. And that may be possible. But, again, I tend to be the type of person that I don't go into the season expecting having those expectations, but it also would not shock me if Bijan is indeed that much better than what we had this past year. And so that brings us to the conversation that we've had a couple of times on this podcast over the last month since drafting Bijan Robinson, which is, the possibility that Bijan may get off to a slower start than maybe people are expecting. And it stems from, we look back to last year with Tyler Algier, despite coming from a very similar outside zone based scheme at BYU to what the Falcons ran. got off to a relatively slow start, right? He averaged 3.9 yards per carry in the first 8 weeks of the 2022 season, and then averaged 5.6 yards in the final 9 weeks, right? And Bijan comes from a more balanced offense that runs a roughly even mix of zoning gap runs at Texas, and arguably was better on the gap stuff, just like Algier was, in my opinion, at BYU. So there could be a learning curve for Bijan, and that doesn't mean that Bijan is going to, struggle in the first half of the season. It just means that the player I expect to see Bijan being in November and December is probably going to be better than the player I think we'll see in September and October. And that obviously, probably brings a smile to many of your faces, because I think a lot of you guys, myself included, think Bijan's going to be a really good player in September and October. So you just imagine, what will he be in November, December, and possibly January. So when we focus on the explosive plays from the running back position, Algier had a team high 6 of those 20+ yard runs last year, but only 1 of those came in the first 8 games. So again, another indicator that Algier got better as the season wore on. So again, that could happen again with Bijan, and it reiterates something you've heard from me before. And you heard Arthur Smith echo similar sentiments this past week at OTAs. And it's basically the idea that, if Bijan is better in the back half of the season than he was in the front half of the season, to quote my good buddy Shannon Sharp, that ain't no problem. That ain't no problem. And you want to be playing your best football down the stretch. And, hopefully the Falcons will be doing that as they gear up for, January football, as opposed to September, October, etc. football. So I think the conclusion is that Bijan will add explosiveness to the run game, because he is that type of dude. He'll also add explosiveness in the passing game. Now, we saw Cordero Patterson generate a number of explosive pass plays, in 2021. And then you look at what, Christian McCaffrey does for the 49ers offense, as well as the Panthers offense when healthy, in terms of what he can add in the passing game. So you're hoping to see similar type of impact from Bijan Robinson this year, because we know that the Falcons are, quote unquote, playing that positionless football, right? Now, we could probably devote an entire podcast to that concept in and of itself, and we've touched upon it briefly over the last month, and again, maybe we'll touch upon it in the future. But we know that the bulk of explosive pass plays come throwing the ball to wide receivers and tight ends, and that's what we'll continue to talk about. And whether or not Kyle Pitts and Drake London and Jonnu Smith and Mac Hollins and all these other guys are the dudes that the Falcons need to be able to generate those explosive pass plays, and we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. But before we get there, guys, I want to give another shout out to my everydayers that check out this podcast as their first listen each and every day. And for those of you that will be making Locked On Falcons your first listen on tomorrow's episode, we will be most likely talking about Clark Phillips, and I'll be giving you the lowdown on what I saw on film while Clark Phillips was at Utah this past year. So that will be your first listen. So make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So let's first talk about Kyle Pitts, because I think if any of these weapons that the Falcons have in the passing game is capable of being, quote unquote, that dude, it is probably Kyle Pitts, right? And we saw Kyle Pitts be an effective yards after catch tight end each of the last years, but he wasn't elite in that regard, right? In the same ways that, say, AJ Brown was at the wide receiver position, or to a lesser extent, Jonnu Smith was at the tight end position. And maybe Kyle Pitts may never be elite. I think he'll always be good after the catch, but never elite after the catch, because watching him at Florida, I didn't think he was ever going to be elite after the catch, because he wasn't that in college. But he's not necessarily the guy that's going to truck a ton of dudes, right? He can run, right? We know Kyle Pitts can move. He, as they say, what's the technical term? He can scoot, right? Like, so it's not to say that Kyle Pitts can't make plays after the catch, but because he's not necessarily like a lot of other tight ends, a Travis Kelce type of guy that, George Kittle, that will lower the shoulder and truck a dude in addition to being able to run, I don't know if he'll ever be elite. Now, the hope is that Jonnu Smith can kind of offset that. As I said, he was very effective after the catch in Tennessee under Arthur Smith. You go back to 2019 and you look at the missed tackles forced metric that PFF puts out there. He ranked 3rd among tight ends in that 2019 season. And then notably, he did rank 3rd among the tight end position last year in New England, despite the fact, by all accounts, he had an underwhelming season. So clearly the skill set is still there, even if he's playing in an offense that isn't necessarily designed to maximize his talents. And the expectation is that Arthur Smith's offense will be that type of unit that can maximize his talents. And so we'll see if him and Pitts, if Smith can be the yak guy and Pitts probably will be less of the yak guy relative to what Jonnu Smith has been and will be, but more of that deep threat. And that's really where I think Pitts can make his hay, as they say, if I probably botched that saying, but can, earn his check um, as a deep threat in the Falcons offense. And we know Pitts has the capability of stretching defenses. We know we're going to need him to stretch defense because the Falcons don't really have that other go-to deep threat. And that was the case last year. He was their primary deep weapon. And we saw that not be effective because of the lack of rapport between him and Mariota. And Mariota was like 1 of 14 on those deep throws to Kyle Pitts. And we imagine a league average quarterback would be 6 of 14 on those deep throws. And then you imagine if Pitts was able to maintain that pace for a full season rather than the 10 games he played last year, we're talking about potentially 25 of those deep 20-plus yard throws to him. And if, again, you're only getting league average accuracy on that, which is roughly 40%, that's 10 explosive plays on those 25 throws. So that's 9 more than what Pitts had a year ago. And so that gets you closer to what Pitts did in 2021, where between him and Matt Ryan, he was 7 for 12 on those deep throws, right? Very efficient in that regard. And so, we'll just have to see if Ritter can improve. That's going to be a big area that Ritter needs to improve. We talked about the red zone. We talked about third down efficiency. We talked about his ability to beat man coverage. Hitting the deep ball is going to be another important factor if we're probably going to be able to get the most out of Kyle Pitts moving forward. And again, we saw the flashes from Ritter with the timing and the touch on some of those deep throws, but we just need to see it work a little bit better. Now, of course, you hope that with more time working with these weapons, Ritter and these guys will get on the same page. But then again, part of you wonders, like, if Kyle Pitts is, on a pitch count this summer because the Falcons are slowly working him back from his knee injury, how quickly can that rapport between him and Desmond Ritter, develop? And we don't know. So that will be something that we'll pay attention to, but we'll probably have to wait to cross that bridge until we get to July to see really where Kyle Pitts is back in terms of his rehab and whether or not he's getting a full workload at the beginning of training camp or they're easing him into it. But again, that's more of a July conversation than necessarily a June conversation. Now, let's talk about Drake London. And I do expect similarly an uptick in explosive plays from Drake London this upcoming season. He finished with a team high 10 20-plus yard plays last year. 6 of those came in the final 6 games without Pitts in the lineup. 4 of those 10 came in the final 4 games with Ritter. And so that's roughly 1 per game. So one would imagine, hey, let's extrapolate that for a full season. That's 17 over the course of a full season. And I think that's probably a safe bet for what Drake London potentially his ceiling could be. I wouldn't go too much higher than that because I don't know if Drake London's ever going to be a super explosive receiver, right? He's not really a great yak guy, right? We love how hard he runs after the catch. He fights for every yard, but he just doesn't have the acceleration or the burst to really be a dangerous yards after catch guy, right? He was 56 among the 80 wide receivers that had at least 50 targets in terms of yak per reception last season as a rookie. And so I don't expect Drake London to be the Falcons version of AJ Brown, right? Like in terms of his yak ability, I think he's probably closer to Corey Davis, which is closer to the league average than necessarily elite like AJ Brown was. And, Mac Hollins is very similar. If you look at those top 80 receivers that had at least 50 targets last year, Mac Hollins was slightly better than Drake, which was 46 out of those 80th guys. So again, roughly closer to league average, slightly below average in that regard. So I don't know if Mac Hollins is really going to be adding a ton there after the catch, but we know he can be a big body down the field, similar to what we're hoping from Kyle Pitts. So when we look at this team's potential to be explosive, I certainly expect more explosive plays from this receiver group than we saw a year ago, but I don't necessarily know if this group is going to be, the end all be all of like, oh man, the Falcons have, I don't know if we're going to be reminded of what Julio and Calvin Ridley were doing at the peak of their powers, right? Here in Atlanta a couple of years ago, when those two guys were among the top 10 most explosive receivers. I think Pitts and London, will be better this year. They combined for 15 last year. I think there's the potential that they could double that number this upcoming season. But I do think, we'll continue to be talking probably in all likelihood, if I'm making bets for what are going to be conversations in 2024, we'll be talking about adding more explosive playmakers. Then maybe the Falcons will add more explosive playmakers between now and the 2024 season. Over the course of the summer, we've talked a lot about the Falcons adding more help at that wide receiver position, although, as I said earlier, Corey Davis was mostly league average when it comes to generating those explosive plays. Hunter Renfrow is not exactly going to be a guy that you're bringing in. Another name that I've thrown out there several times over the last couple of weeks. You're not bringing Hunter Renfrow because you're looking to be more explosive. You're bringing Hunter Renfrow because you want him to be valuable in the red zone and on third downs. He can move the chains and help you be a more efficient, methodical offense, not be a more explosive offense. And so this may be a 2024 issue, as I said, right? But we'll just see how big of a 2024 issue based off of how well this unit in offense performs in 2023. And again, I expect the running backs to be, to help out in that regard. We saw the Falcons throwing the ball to the running back in the 4 weeks under Desmond Ridder that we didn't necessarily see in the first 13 games with Marcus Mariota. And that's not necessarily a knock on Mariota. It was just basically a lot of the team's play calling was designed to max protect and keep those running backs in for pass protection rather than having those guys come out of the backfield as pass catchers. And that was a reason why we did not see the ball be thrown to the running backs nearly as much in 2022 as we did in 2021. But when you look at the explosive pass plays from the running back position in 2022, they only had 4. In 2021, they had 11. So hopefully in 2023, that number will rebound back to more of the 2021 numbers, if not higher, because of the presence of Patterson and Bijan and Algier and all that and more. So last year, again, the Falcons had 54 explosive plays. And, I think getting to 70, which would be like roughly top 5 in the league last year, is an achievable dream, although I wouldn't necessarily be as gung-ho about predicting it at this point in time until probably maybe later in the summer. I might be a little bit more optimistic on that front once we actually get to see what, guys look like in camp and in preseason and all that stuff. But, I certainly think 60, 65 is a very achievable number, and that would be in the upper half of the league this upcoming season. So I feel like the Falcons do have enough dudes, but, obviously there's room for improvement there. So, I think if we assume the Falcons will be top 15 in explosive plays, which again, I think is relatively conservative based off of the conversation we've had today, you couple that with a top 3 run game, which is what they were last year, a top 10 third down offense, which is what they were last year, and a top 10 red zone offense. They were 14th last year, but they were 9th at the time when they switched to Desmond Ridder. So they were actually a top 10 red zone offense under Marcus Mariota. And to get back to that, that combination means to me that this is going to be a very effective and efficient offense, even if it isn't necessarily the world's most explosive offense. And in that situation, if the defense is just average, that's a combination that I think is probably going to be playing meaningful games in January. And that's not so bad when you consider that the Falcons are quote unquote settling for a bottom 5 quarterback like Desmond Ridder. Again, that is what the rest of the world says about this team. But we know here on Locked On Falcons that we think a little bit better of this team in that regard. So overall, I do think it is a promising picture or outlook for this upcoming season with this team being more explosive than they are. It's just really about dialing in on exactly how much more explosive that this team is going to be. How much more efficient is this team going to be? And there's also obviously, the possibility that they take steps back in that regard, but we'll cross that bridge if we get to it. But that, I hope, gives you guys some thoughts and opinions on this team's potential to be explosive. I would love to hear your feedback on who do you guys think will be sort of that go-to threat. Again, I think if I was putting money on it, I think Pitts is the guy that I would bet the most on with the highest ceiling in terms of explosive potential, but certainly Jonnu, Drake, Bijan certainly I think are not bad bets if you want to go there. So would love to hear your feedback on that, guys, but we'll just have to save that for a future episode. But tomorrow's episode will be all about Clark Phillips, where I'll be giving you my detailed film breakdown and scouting report of Clark Phillips and what my expectations are for him here in Atlanta. That will be your first listen on tomorrow's episode. But for your second listen today or tomorrow, why not check out the Locked On NFL podcast to see what's going on around the league? There are still moves being made. Leonard Floyd to Buffalo. We still don't know where DeAndre Hopkins is going to land. So go check out Locked On NFL to see what the latest is going on for the other 31 NFL teams. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every